All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anant. I'm a professor of economics at UW-Madison, where I hold the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Chair of Economics. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, which is sponsoring this event along with Wisconsin YAF, Young Americans for Freedom. The Center for Research on Wisconsin Economy is a market-oriented policy research center housed in the Department of Economics. We support and disseminate policy research with a particular focus on Wisconsin and state-level policy issues. Our activities include research, student support, and events such as this one today. I was actually truly hoping to have a debate, two economists, and I'm also very much hoping to invite or to be able to have on the show one of Obama's chief economists to talk about Harris's policies. So now on to our speaker. Casey Mulligan is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. He served as chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration from September 2018 to August 2019. Casey received numerous awards and fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the Manhattan Foundation, the Alfred Sloan Foundation, the Smith Richardson Foundation, and the John Olin Foundation. His research covers capital and labor taxation, gender wage gap, health economics, Social Security, voting, and the economics of aging. Casey has written widely on discrepancies between economic analysis and conventional wisdom. Before his book, You're Hired, he wrote Chicago Price Theory, The Redistribution Recession, and Parental Priorities and Economic Inequality, a book that you gave to me during my job talk at Chicago in 2000. He has also written numerous op-eds and blog entries for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other blogs and periodicals. Please join me in welcoming Casey Mulligan. Casey, thanks for being here. I was looking at your academic CV, and it lists a bachelor's degree at Harvard in 1991 and a PhD from the University of Chicago in 1993. Is that a typo? A PhD in 2 years? Could you speak?
I wanted to get it in 1 year. You know, when you're these guys' age, a year seems like a really long time, right? At my age, it seems much shorter, but I said, oh, I can do it in a year, but I was having so much fun, it took 2 years.
Fair enough. Could you speak a little bit about your journey from Harvard to Chicago? You had a pretty illustrious PhD thesis committee with 2 Nobel Laureates, maybe 3?
They didn't have those prizes at the time, but they were, excellent advisors. Nancy Stokey was the chairperson of my committee, and then Bob Lucas and Gary Becker were. I just picked my dissertation topic, be whatever was in the intersection what those 3 did. I ended up doing something on intergenerational mobility. Came a book.
It's awesome. So just in terms of housekeeping for today, I'll shoot for 40 to 45 minutes of prepared questions for Casey. We welcome audience questions. You probably have this barcode that you could scan and type in a question. If you don't like a question, you can downvote it, or if you like it, you can upvote it. And by popular demand, Gabby Gerard, the chairwoman of YAF, will end up asking questions at the end of the 45-minute period. All right.
I would love to have the questions from all these folks.
It'll be good to have audience questions. Last week, a 50 basis point cut by the Federal Reserve. Did you expect this? Is this a sign that the Fed views the fight against inflation to be over? Or is it a little more concerned about unemployment than inflation at this point?
I don't pay a lot of attention to the Fed. I don't think they matter except for inflation. When inflation's important in its own right, and the unemployment's got nothing to do with what the Fed does, in my opinion. I think they use it as a smokescreen to make themselves more important than they really are. The real action at the Fed actually is regulation, not monetary policy. There are major regulators. Remember when about a year and a half ago, the Silicon Valley Bank went down? I mean, it was the Fed dropped the ball, the San Francisco Fed. So that's, as a policymaker, I encourage pay attention to what the Fed does in its regulating. The monetary policy is, as long as inflation's under control, that's a sideshow. The real action's in the regulation.
I want to start talking about oil prices. On the first day in his office, Biden effectively revoking a crucial permit for the Keystone XL pipeline followed, a temporary suspension of drilling in public lands, freezing and then scrapping leases in an Arctic wildlife refuge, and the country's first nationwide fee on a greenhouse gas. When Putin ordered tanks to Ukraine, his policy shifted. He urged drillers to produce more oil. Profits then went up. And then he accused ExxonMobil of making more money than God. He then cracked down again on oil and gas, suspending new licenses on LNG terminals. It seems there was less predictability than was optimal, and that can have a negative impact on longer-term investment in a crucial industry. What is Trump likely to do different than Biden?
We keep saying drill, baby, drill. And that, I mean, the basic idea being that the oil and gas industry is one of the special talents that we have. Not every country is good at everything, but we are good at extracting energy resources, and you know, we should flourish. We should use our talents, not hide them under a basket. You know, and that being the basic idea from a world point of view, it's incredibly important. You know, in some parts of the world, like in Saudi Arabia, you just trip over a pile of sand and oil comes out. It comes out so easily. So it's the Saudis are in a position where, you know, they don't need innovation and kind of thing that we have. But we have a very innovative oil industry. And as a result, we've kind of become the swing supplier in the world. And when oil prices go up, our guys and girls, they figure out ways to bring more oil to the market. When oil prices go down, they sit back and relax a little more. The Middle Eastern governments, the Saudis and the others, they know this, that we're the swing producers. And so if they try to extract more revenue from the oil consumers of the world, they know that we're going to step in and prevent that price from going up too much. And so when there came a Biden administration who did not have a drill baby drill attitude, they knew that this is their opportunity to try to jack up prices. And that's what they did. So you had a really double whammy on supply. You had our own supply being restricted. Then you were really inviting OPEC to restrict its own supply.
Let's pivot to talking about regulation, a related issue for the oil and gas industry. Trump pulled back on regulation. Businesses felt as though there was a difference when dealing with the regulatory authorities. Biden made the regulatory authorities much more active, making it tougher on business. In some of your work, you state, at the end of 2022, the Biden administration imposed new regulatory costs on American households and businesses at a pace surpassing that of the Obama administration during a comparable period. The added costs from these Biden-era final rules, which include both their current and expected future costs, amount to almost $10,000 for every American household. If regulatory costs continue to rise at the same rate as they did during the Obama administration, the total costs of Biden's rulemaking over an 8-year period would almost reach $60,000 per household. What was the impact of these regulations on the average American?
I actually updated that study this summer. So basically, by this summer, I was familiar with all the Biden regulations. Now we know there's only going to be one term. So and I think I have a chart on that where the more updated results. My database goes back through all the way to the beginning of President Obama's term. And it has something like 6,000 regulations in it. And in those regulations, the agencies assert what they cost. Now remember who's writing it, right? It's the agency writing, you know, don't worry, our regulations didn't cost much. But what I did is just add up the costs that they admit to. And you can see by—
Casey, not to interrupt, could you give an example of the types of regulations you have in mind here?
Well, there are thousands, but the number one regulation, if you just want to pick one, would be the manufacturing standards on automobiles. Now automobiles are required to, almost all of them, to be electric. It's basically where they're going. They set it in terms of emission standards and ignoring the long tailpipe type of issue. And they set it in terms of miles per gallon standards. It makes cars very expensive because people don't want those type of cars. They want they're typically they want their larger cars and they have long distance cars and things like that. So it makes cars very expensive. And that would be a regulatory cost, which the agency could count. Now, that's a bad example in the sense that that agency is actually pretty honest about its cost. And they estimated when Biden did the latest standards rule, they estimated almost $1 trillion in costs from that one rule. Remember, there are thousands of rules. That one rule they admit $1 trillion worth. And from a practical point of view, it's making cars cost. That one rule that Biden did, Obama also did others that had the same effect, and these keep accumulating. But the one Biden rule is adding about $3,000 to the price of a new car. And so what I did in this first part of the chart is add up all the costs that they acknowledge. And then I put it on a per household basis. So we're not talking in trillions or billions and things like that. We say, well, on a per household basis. And you can see that the Biden-Harris administration's moving along at quite a faster clip than the Obama administration, which was itself well known for its, I think President Obama said, I got a phone and I got a pen, which he meant is he's going to regulate things without Congress's approval. So you can see that here, and you can see a very small number by comparison, might as well be zero for Trump. Now, they already mentioned the problem with these numbers is that the agency, and a lot of the agencies, not the one that wrote the auto rule, but a lot of the other agencies, they don't even estimate their costs. Net neutrality, one of the most famous regulations in the last couple of decades, they had no estimate of what it cost. And so I put together my own estimates for the top, let's say 100 rules. And I put that in here. So if you click next, you have my own estimates of the costs. And that comes out to be 47,000 per person as compared to 26,000 for President Obama, and then minus 11,000 President Trump. President Trump was removing regulations. A lot of them, they were regulations that President Obama put in, and President Trump took them out, and then President Biden put them back. Kind of the pattern here.
What about the
Now,
incidence?
these are present value. You're not getting a bill every year for 47,000. But these auto rules, they last forever is a little bit of exaggeration, but they last a lot of years. So every time you go to buy a car, it's going to cost $3,000 more because of that. And that's kind of in there. Your internet's going to cost $8 or $9 a month more every month for quite a long time. And I've added that up in present value terms. If you rather put it on a per year basis, it would be something more like the 47,000 would look more like, say, 4,000 a year every year.
What is the incidence of these in terms of who bears these costs? The wealthy, the poor?
It is, if you didn't have my data code and Excel spreadsheet, you could still do this pretty well on your own. Number one, think about who makes the rules. A bunch of people with PhDs. They don't really familiar with life most Americans live. So you can guess what they're going to do. They're going to do things that don't really phase higher income people, but they do phase lower income people. You think about what they regulated. We mentioned energy and cars. These are necessities, not in the sense that you're going to die if you don't have those things, but when in economics, when we say something's a necessity, we mean that low income people spend a bigger fraction of their income on that. So gasoline would be a necessity. Internet service would be a necessity. And it's remarkable. They always regulating necessities. So you add up all the different things that they're regulating and allocate the costs across the households. It comes out very big. I have a slide on that. I've put households into 4 and 5 groups according to their income, the lowest income people on the left, the highest income people on the right, the middle income people in the middle, and so on. And I've shown that I found that the regulatory costs were about 7 times adjusted for their income for the bottom quintile than they are for the top. And then I've kind of broken down, what are the types of regulations? Really, almost all the regulations kind of work out like this because they're always going after the necessities. But the more obvious one might be the climate one, because that looks a lot more like adding to the price of gasoline or adding to the price of energy, adding to the price of electricity. And these things are necessities, so they're going to really hit the budgets of the lower income people harder.
Let's pivot to talking about inflation. When I was an undergrad, we just thought that it was almost always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, Milton Friedman. I think that view seems to be changing a little bit. And I think the economics profession is effectively recognizing fiscal forces as being important. John Cochrane, Robert Barrow, even I believe you've looked into this issue about what's the imposition of fiscal policies on why we have a high inflation. So could you speak a bit to, apart from the Fed, which let's leave that aside. No, you don't want to talk about the Fed. What kind of policies could we be employing in order to make sure that we keep inflation in check?
Yeah, now the monetary phenomenon is a bit oversimplification of what we had years ago. You had Sargent and Wallace saying, look, it's part of the government budget. You need to be careful. You think about, well, when's the government going to need to print money? It's not so easy to say don't print money. If it's the only revenue source they have, they're kind of going to do it. So it's always been a fiscal angle on it. Now the emphasis may be shifted now, partly because I think kind of the shocks and the circumstances have kind of shifted it. So we're emphasizing that part of the theory. I think it's kind of always been there. I had a piece that I wrote years ago called Inflation and the Size of Government, where we tried to look at, well, when you have a lot of government spending, you got a lot of inflation. And I said, well, a lot of cases you don't. Sweden went crazy on the welfare state in the 60s and 70s, didn't have a huge amount of inflation. But where I found the inflation was in the wars. And from an economist point of view, I say, well, one aspect of wars is they're temporary, they're sudden, lots of spending involved. And I viewed COVID as a war. So I thought, right, when we're coming out of COVID, we're going to have inflation kind of in proportion with the war we're fighting. And then Barrow, I think, looked across countries, a very different approach. Instead of looking at historically at wars, he was looking across different countries, had different spending packages across Europe, across our hemisphere. And he had a similar finding that government spending was leading to inflation. But really, the way to have less inflation in the United States coming out of COVID was to have a smaller war. In my view, we should have stopped the government spending on COVID early in 2021. We had the vaccine. We were getting back to business. We shouldn't have been throwing out these trillions, but we ended up throwing $2 trillion out the door after I would view the pandemic is over. And that created a lot of inflation, probably added 6 points onto the inflation.
More than 50 years ago, Nixon showed us how dangerous unchecked executive power can be to the free enterprise when he announced, I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States. Harris proposed a national ban on price gouging for food and groceries. She plans to give the FTC and prosecutors the authority to go after companies that are believed to be involved in price fixing or price gouging. What is the economics behind the determination of that? Could that be an effective strategy, price controls?
Price controls don't have a good empirical history. They've been tried, they don't work too good. Also, in theory, I mean, we're market oriented. Whether you're market oriented or not, markets are around us all over the place. And prices are essential for coordinating all the people that we have to coordinate with to live our lives and eat our food and have our homes and so on. So interfering with the price system is a bad idea in theory, and it's proven to be a bad idea in practice. So why does it keep coming back? This is a debate that George Stigler and Milton Friedman used to have with each other. Milton Friedman said, well, people just need more of an education. They need to read more of my books. I need to go more on TV. And there's some truth to that. But Stigler's view was, no, there's special interests who are going to benefit from these regulations. Are bad on the whole, but there's a little benefit there that's going to go to a special interest, and they're pushing for it. So I think these bad ideas keep coming back because there are special interests. And we were deregulating. In my previous chart, we showed the yellow one going down, 11,000 for President Trump. But we had some regulations there, adding costs, and some of them there were price controls. Price controls in the pharmaceutical sector we had. I was pushing against that and explaining all the things I'm explaining now, but we had that policy. And guess who was pushing for it? The president of the pharmaceutical manufacturers who were going to benefit from it. So, some things never change, and that's.
Your time with the Trump administration, was it just utter chaos? Did you write any of President Trump's late night tweets on the economy?
those connected, but I will answer both. I was very nervous going there because, you know, I live in Illinois. Washington, D.C. is far away. And what am I getting myself into? Well, the New York Times says I'm going to get myself into a backstabbing, chaotic situation. I know the New York Times is lying, but that doesn't tell me what's true, right? So I was pretty nervous. And I came in with a plan for what I should do over a year period, my year leave of absence. It was a 10 or 12 step plan. And the first day I had to get my badge. It takes a whole day because it's government. Then the second day I presented it to the senior staff there and I said, look, these are the things I think I should do. Okay. I said, great, start doing it. And I did them. And on the last day, I finished the 11th thing with 4 hours to spare. It was a very predictable year. I knew what the president needed before the president asked. It was very predictable compared to what? I'm used to academia. I'm not sure an academic year is so predictable as that. So that's the opposite of chaos. But you know, the English dictionary is evolving, so maybe chaos just means Trump, no matter what actually is happening in there. So it was very non-chaotic. Now on the tweeting part, the important part of communication, I knew that because, like I said, I didn't know what was going on there because the news is not going to tell you. So he has to communicate directly with people, and the Twitter was great for that. He had 80 million followers or something like that, and he could say things, and they couldn't get censored. No, well, January of 2021, it wouldn't get censored. Now he's sitting there in his bathrobe and slippers doing all these tweets. That's the image he wants to project. He wants to think it's coming directly from him, and for good reasons. I mean, that's, people pick up on that. But I was in meetings, dozens, if not hundreds of people going over a tweet before it went out. And I wrote some tweets. And again, it's not like I write it and then I put it on there and plus send. I wrote some tweets and then I had to go through a bunch of meetings and I had to defend it and to talk about it. And then finally it went out there. So there's very much a machine there. President Trump doesn't want you to know about that. He wants to think it's just him. He'll quickly tell you, oh, Mrs. Clinton has this massive staff of social media people and it's just me and Dan. Well, it's you and Dan, but it's also Dan Scavino was the director of social media. And so a lot of his staff are involved in that. In those.
You were a Chicago price theory kind of guy. How could you support tariffs?
Well, we didn't support tariffs.
That's a cheap version of the question.
We didn't support. We never.
I'll rephrase. How could you work for the tariff man?
Well, he had all views there, and so he had Navarro. Navarro was his pro-tariff people, and it depends who he was dealing with. When the Chinese officials came to Washington to visit, he would have Navarro out there, and we would be hidden away. But then when he was talking to Republican congressmen who don't like tariffs, then we would be out there talking about, oh, the tariffs are raising the prices and blah, blah, blah. So he knew the arguments, and he knew who would express them best. And we, without ever failing, we said, oh, tariffs are a tax on a particular category of goods, namely those that you import.
A better version of that question is, imagine the objective is to deliver a certain degree of protectionism. And the question is, do you go with tariffs or do you go with quotas like past presidents did?
Yeah, now this never came up in the White House. We were pure. Partly we had to go back to academics where we would be hung for doing anything, at least been impure on tariffs. But when I'm not advising there, I could say, look, yeah, every president's had protectionism. And there are some better ways to protect and less better ways, given that you're going to protect. Free trade's the best. But then once we're stepping down from the best onto some protectionism, they're not all equal. And one comparison I've made in some of my writings is between Reagan and Trump. Reagan would give a beautiful speech, will bring tears to my eyes about the beauties of free trade. He's not only beautiful and emotional, it's correct. Okay. But you look at what Reagan did. He did a lot of quotas. What would happen back then? It wasn't China, it was Japan. The Japanese companies would come into the White House and they'd say, we would like a quota. And he'd say, okay. So why did the Japanese want a quota? Because that means it gives the Japanese companies a way of coordinating with each other and say, look, let's withhold our products from the United States. Quota makes it withheld. So we have fewer cars, Japanese cars coming to the United States, so we can charge more for our Japanese cars. And Detroit loves it because the Japanese are charging more for their cars. So then Detroit either can sell more cars or charge more for Detroit cars. So everybody's happy except the consumer. And whereas a tariff, the foreign companies are upset with the tariff because they're not getting that money. Our consumers paying more, just like with the quota, but their revenues going to the Treasury. So that's an important difference. And you saw when Biden came in, a number of the Trump tariffs were converted into Biden quotas, particularly in Europe. And guess what the Europeans did right away when that conversion was made? Quietly, they said, thank you very much. We love having those profits. But publicly, they said the trade war is over. Because now they're benefiting. The war against the consumer is still continuing, but the war against the European companies has ended.
Is it likely we're going to see tariffs continuing on going forward?
Well, protectionism is very likely, whether it be in a tariff or quota form. I'm not sure. Biden tended to do more of the quotas, although he didn't back down on many tariffs. But I don't think President Trump has much interest in
Content-specific question. So in 2017, Trump broke ground on an LCD factory that he called the eighth wonder of the world. The scale of the promise was indeed enormous. $10 billion of investment from a Taiwanese electronics giant called Foxconn, which promised 13,000 jobs. Very little manufacturing actually occurred as a consequence of the Foxconn project. Do you think more protectionism and corporate welfare can be effective in keeping manufacturing in states like Wisconsin strong?
corporate welfare is a rather broad term, but that Foxconn episode is a dismal episode. We had an earlier episode. That's why it's so dismal that we had an earlier episode in Connecticut, New London, Connecticut. Pfizer wanted to build an office park or something like that, and they the town fathers of New London decided, well, this will be great. We're going to clear off some land for Pfizer, and we're going to have development. They took the houses of some people in New London. Became the famous case of Kelo versus New London, and they were allowed to do that. They used eminent domain. Took Mrs. Kelo as a person. They took Mrs. Kelo's house in the name of development. They called it Blight. I believe they used the same trick down there in Racine County. And you can go there today. There's nothing there. Pfizer ended up not moving there, and they haven't built anything. And a lot of states saw that happen. It was rather famous. This was in 2000. The case got decided, I think, 2005 or so. A lot of states reacted and said, "Oh, federal government's not really protecting property rights here. We're going to need to protect our own." I believe Wisconsin themselves put in some laws, but not good enough to stop this Wisconsin. They gobbled up private property for that Foxconn project. Never happened.
Tax cuts. Do you really think temporary tax cuts were the way to go with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? Is Trump likely to extend these when they're supposed to expire next year? He certainly seems to be signaling more tax cuts if he were to become president, including making Social Security income tax free. Did you think the TCJA had the effect that it promised in terms of economic growth?
One of the fascinating debates we can have around TCJA, at the same time, we were deregulating. We had economic growth, we had wages growing. I remember the first project I said we need to do is, hey, look, guys, we need to measure. Remember I said I got my badge and then I said I got to do projects. The first project says we need to measure wage growth because the fake news is saying that wages aren't growing. They're not keeping up with inflation. And that's what the fake news was saying. That wasn't true. We established that, and now we know that in 2017 and 2018, 2019, wages grew a lot more than inflation. But anyway, is that due to deregulation or is it due to the tax cuts? That's harder to know, not harder to know. Probably some of both. In our profession as a whole, until the orange-haired bad man showed up on the scene, our profession as a whole agreed that, look, we can't have this rate out of line with the rest of the world, corporate rate. We used to be in line back in the 60s and 70s, and then the rest of the world started bringing down their corporate rate. And we all knew Larry Summers, from between Larry Summers and me, I learned in Larry Summers' class, look, you can't, this can't persist. We're going to have to bring our rate in line with the rest of the world. We're in a, interconnected world, et cetera, et cetera. So bringing our rate back out of line with the rest of the world doesn't seem like a good move. But the empirical case is tougher to make due to the confounding deregulation.
Harris plans to tax unrealized capital gains and estate taxation for the ultra wealthy. She proposes raising capital gains tax for top earners. Why is that such a bad idea? Why not soak the rich?
Well, I think we still teach in economics here. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong with the topic of tax incidence. Who pays for the tax? Lawyers have a very different answer than economists, right? Who pays for the tax in an economist view is the one who can escape from it the most easily. That's whatever curve is more elastic. That's basically the tax incidence analysis. And the richer people are more mobile. I mean, one of the pictures I show in my class, I should have brought that one, the picture of Gerard Depardieu. You guys are probably too young, but when I was a kid, he was big in the movies, French actor. He moved out of France because the taxes were so down high. It's easy for him to move, change country. I work in the Kenneth C. Griffin Department of Economics. Ella Griffin and Ella Mulligan were classmates in Chicago. Guess who found it easier to pick up and move to Florida due to the crime, the taxes, and things like that. And the Griffins moved. So the rich, number one issue in analyzing this from a sober point of view is the rich are mobile. And so you can try to tax them and you're going to end up, the tax is going to fall somewhere else. Even though legally on paper, it looks like, well, I'm taxing people. And that's really the principle behind lower rates on business taxation and things like that, that even Sweden figured out, years ago and sticks with it, that if we tax businesses, we're going to have fewer businesses. And who's going to be harmed the most by that? It's not the business owners. They can own a business somewhere else in the world. It's going to be the people who work there and the people who consume there.
You've written a lot on human capital. It's one of the main resources in the economy. What policies would Trump do to promote human capital, boost marriage rates, boost birth rates?
Written more on it than me, but I regret that. No, I'm happy for your achievements, but one of the things that we did not analyze as much as I would have liked during those 4 years was the human capital element of things. And part of that is the human capital is more over time thing. And you're like, it's a democracy. We're only here temporarily in this job. So we weren't looking that far ahead. Doesn't make it unimportant. It's very important. And I think one of the places that human capital kind of dropped, the ball was dropped in that type of analysis. I was already out of the White House by then, was around the COVID. This idea of paying people lots of money not to work and bonuses not to work. We already had a program to pay people when they're out of work. We had bonuses on top of that. And one of the things that I believe was a big problem with that is the effects on human capital. That, look, when I'm not working, I'm accumulating different types of capital, or not accumulating things that are going to help me be productive on my job because I'm not at the job. You also had the stay-at-home element, which was terrible for, normal economies function by the older people with the wisdom passing it down to the younger people. They weren't in the office together anymore. So this was a human capital disaster. And by that time I was at home, just calling people and texting people, trying to push for more emphasis on human capital. But it'd been nice if the policies would have paid more attention to human capital. We're still seeing, I think, the fruits of that today. Of course, we see the things on test scores on students, but guess what? I'm glad students learn, but also young adults are learning too. We don't have test scores to measure that, but guarantee you that retardation of that learning we measure in the test scores for students, it's happening with the younger people. And so companies aren't being run as well. Universities aren't being run as well because you have younger people who aren't following that human capital profile that people before had. I like to point to the example, with the Bud Light fiasco. Somebody had to say, well, this would be a good idea for marketing beer. I'm not in marketing, so I don't know how to market beer, but you had a younger person making that call. And there was an older person leaning over his shoulder and say, you know what, maybe you want to think twice about that, or maybe you don't want to roll that out quite so broadly. And it ruined a huge brand. And it just totally ruined the Budweiser brand on a poor decision. And those are the types of things. We had the ship crashing into the bridge. These are the types of things that happen when people don't have their full training.
CNN's Fareed Zakaria had an episode on the decline of American universities. He says, America's top universities should abandon their long misadventure into politics, retrain their gaze on their core strengths, and rebuild their reputations as centers of learning and of research and learning. We've gone from centers of excellence to institutions pushing political agendas. American universities, according to him, have been neglecting a core focus on excellence. The most obvious one, he points out, is the lack of diversity, is political diversity amongst faculty. At UW-Madison, 99.1% of all faculty dollars flowed to Democrats. We moved from an era where there were speech codes, statements issued on numerous social issues, elimination of SAT scores, to now a bit more of a push to the center. And many campuses, including UW-Madison, are adopting viewpoint neutrality, pretty much following the Chicago Calvin report. What do you think of the status of universities in terms of in centers of innovation and excellence? Are you seeing progress that you're happy with?
I mean, some of the gems, we've been exporting as a country, been exporting diplomas for a long time. I mean, our universities have been pretty darn good. The people would come around the world to get educated here and not so much going in the other direction. So it's a shame to squander that, a little bit like our oil and gas, maybe even more so. But some of the gems in our education industry, the Harvards and the Yales, are applicable what they're doing. They've gone on an entirely different mission than discovery and learning and things like that. Now, what can mitigate some of the losses from that would be competition. If we have competition and that's one of the things that's kept us ahead of Europe, that we have some kinds of competition. Other universities can step in when there's an opportunity, and we're seeing that. We're seeing, for example, Clemson University in South Carolina, with the October 7th, things like that. A lot of New England applications that would have gone to the Ivy League from New England are now coming down to Clemson. I'm a little worried my son's not going to be able to get in there now because it's so hard, so competitive. And so, yeah, I think competition can help there. And competition, I don't want to pretend to be the central planner. It doesn't work, right? I don't know what universities exactly should do, but I think the competitive system can discover what it can do and what's going to work best. And one of the things that kind of frustrates me being in this industry is I remember when we started at the University of Chicago. I mean, I wasn't alive then, but I'm familiar with the history of my university. We took off right away by being different. We didn't do the same thing as Harvard and Yale. They were discriminating then against particularly Jewish students and faculty. We were like, you're a nerd, come. And we got to be the best in so many subjects by grabbing the people that were discriminated against at Harvard and Yale. I have trouble getting that argument to fly today. I mean, there's an incentive for administrators to be like the other universities rather than be unique. Be like the other universities so they can get a promotion to be a higher administrator in one of those other places. So that's been, I think, a little frustrating. But still, I'm an optimist. And I think there's enough universities out there. Some will take their own path. Students, donors, faculty will appreciate that path, and then there'll still be opportunities for the students of the future.
I want to follow up with Scientific American which has been in continuous publication since 1845, featuring great minds such as Einstein and Oppenheimer, recently endorsed Harris. By taking an explicit position on the 2024 and the 2020 election, they seem to be directly equating science with leftism. To quote them, Scientific American seems to be criticizing Trump's support as president for a work requirement as a condition for Medicaid eligibility, one of the issues that they brought up in their editorial. By contrast, the editorial says Ms. Harris supports science and would improve health by expanding Medicaid coverage. So Scientific American seems to make clear that anything that qualifies as science, for it to qualify as science, it has to come dangerously close to supporting a bigger welfare state. And that whether the welfare state increases health or not is not up for debate. You worked on several of these issues, including work requirements. What do you think?
See, my other projects in the White House was to create an economics of socialism course for the president and his staff, because he had opponents who basically have Marxist views, like we shall not have profit. Example, straight from Marx. Marx called it surplus value, but otherwise we shall not have profit, said Marx, and that's what they're being said today. And in developing that course, I did a lot of research on countries that had tried it. You know, how does the Marxism thing work out in practice? And every time you see it tried, they always claim to be scientific. The Soviet Union was like, we're not going to have this market chaos with all these stupid, greedy businessmen leading us places. We're going to have scientists lead us places. Well, how'd that work out?
I want to stop with two last questions before I hand it over to Gabby. Debt deficits in the economy. We have this political theater every October, a succession of artificial cliffs, shutdown deadlines. But the real issue is that over the next 75 years, American taxpayers face over 73 trillion in long-term unfunded obligations. Is Trump likely to start making progress on the longer-term debt issue as any president, or is it just likely that we'll have to wait before any significant action will be taken?
Likely mean we're greater than 50% or greater than Harris.
Let's just wait to see when Social Security is going to go bankrupt, and the day before that,
the
insolvent.
Economic growth will put off the insolvency date, which is kind of an accounting concept, but I'll stick with it. Economic growth will put off insolvency date. The other thing that I think the Trump administration has in mind is, I believe they call it impoundment. I'm not a lawyer. The idea that, look, we don't have to spend all the money that Congress authorizes. We can spend less. We don't think it's going to a good use. That would be quite a new thing. At least in my lifetime, that'd be quite a new thing. Whether it works, I mean, the thing about innovation, ideas seem good and sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. That's why I'm not sure it's greater than a 50% chance. Certainly there are new things that are going to be tried.
But also be a new thing to not add deficits to the economy. Last question. In my view, we're in an exciting time in America. We're probably in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, with perhaps some headwinds with the debt to GDP ratio exploding, with some caveats. America benefited from the baby boom, but the cost of these liabilities may show up sooner than later. Regardless, I really worry there's a race to the bottom with populism, where the worst ideas get amplified and imitated. No tax on tips. I'd love for all my wages to be in the form of tips. Is there any hope that sensible and good economics will prevail beyond this populist rhetoric?
I think we had very good economic policy. There were some exceptions, like the price controls in healthcare that I mentioned the first term. Very good economic policy. And, you know, the past is one solid foundation to build a prediction of the future. It's not a guarantee that you're going to repeat, but to have the idea that the second Trump term would be drastically different than the first one seems a stretch. I mean, it could happen, but it seems like a stretch. So I would be optimistic from that perspective.
Thank you, Casey. Please join me in thanking Casey for spending some time with us. I want to hand it over to Gabby, who's the chairwoman of Wisconsin's YAF, to ask the audience questions. Take it away, Gabby.
Thank you so much. Our first question from the audience is, are there any significant economic policy differences that you expect in a Trump 2024 policy compared to his first term?
The impoundment is something that would be different. In general, we kind of thought where there would be 2 consecutive terms. So when we were getting into year 3, we were having in mind things for year 5, 6, and 7. And there I looked kind of the Reagan profile. A lot of the foreign policy accomplishments happened in Reagan's second term. The foundation was laid, I think, dealing with Japan and some of the other countries. Foundation was laid, but he got the payoff. One of the things that Reagan was looking for was intellectual property protection in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, places like that. And finally, we got them to, start to enforce copyrights on patents and things like that. And that's the same kind of trajectory we were hoping for with around China trade. So I'd like to see some things around that. Those are the 2 that come to the top of my head: the policy and the dealing with the budget.
Great, thank you. What was the decision to institute tariffs driven more by legitimate economic theory or geopolitical tensions? And is it worth sacrificing efficiency for geopolitics, considering the negative effects?
You have this issue that even Paul Krugman acknowledges, of the intellectual property theft in China. What do you do about it? You have somebody breaking the rules within your own jurisdiction. Well, we have like laws and police who have guns to enforce the laws. So we want to send guns to China to enforce? So we're going to do something else. I would rather not the guns. I went to military school. I know how to use a gun, but I don't want to see them used. So what are you going to do? Is tariffs the way? I'm not sure. I mean, Paul Krugman doesn't think tariff is the way. But something needs to be done about it, especially as our country becomes more and more producers of this intellectual property. We have to look out for our interest in that regard. And the tariffs were intended to do that. And again, I point back to Reagan. When I was in the White House, I was not pointing back to Reagan. I just said tariffs equal bad. But after I got out, I said, look, Reagan also put on some tariffs to try to bring intellectual property protections and incentive for Japan and Taiwan. We had to have those protections. And that happened in term 2.
Next we have, do you think the Middle East's plan to move away from the dollar as the global oil and gas currency is feasible? And if so, what do you see that doing to the US dollar?
In the United States is extraordinary. That people want to use our currency. Not many countries are in that position. And that kind of gives us cheap loans. Another way to look at it's an export. We're exporting whatever it is about a dollar that people like. Is it Ben Franklin's picture or whatever it is they like about it? We're exporting that service, and it's pretty easy thing for us to produce. It's not, doesn't hurt our environment or anything like that. It'd be a shame to ruin that product. I've mentioned some good products that America has. It'd be a shame to ruin any of them. That's one of the really, from a worldwide perspective, a spectacular thing that's and around the world. We would lose. I mean, we would lose living standard. Government budget would be in a tighter position if our currency was just like any other currency.
A common argument is that presidents' policies really take effect after they leave office, i.e. it was good under Trump because of Obama and bad under Biden because of Trump. Is this true?
And it varies a lot. I looked in those 6,000 regulations. I mean, one of the challenges of trying to aggregate all that is some of these regulations take effect very quickly and they have a long time frame, and others are delayed. So there's quite a mix. There are some policies that don't take effect for a while, others that take effect quicker. An example, I think, very important example I can think of is Operation Warp Speed. We started working on that in, let me say, late 2018. Always hard to say when the beginning was, but we didn't call it warp speed back then. The idea being the next time we're sitting there in 2018, we say next time the US is in a pandemic, we cannot have the bureaucrats slow walk the new products. That was our thinking. You know, how can we implement that? What are the different procedural things that need to be put in place? We started on that in 2018. We weren't in a big hurry. We didn't see a pandemic at the time. The executive orders went in 2019, September. So that's about 9 months worth of lag time. And then 5 months later, we had a pandemic and we were benefiting from Operation Warp Speed. So what does that add up to? Maybe 2 years or so. So there's some element of that. You have other policies like deregulating internet service, the service you have on your phone or on your cable box at home. Deregulated that in March 2017. Was our second full month being in office. Prices of internet plans fell within days. They fell so sharply that the Federal Reserve chairperson felt she had to call a special news conference to assuage the markets because they were like, why is inflation so low? What did you guys do? Answer, she did nothing. We deregulated, we brought down internet prices, and internet prices are a significant part. It's kind of what in that other chart I showed, a significant enough part of people's budget that actually moved the aggregate CPI. So that happened, you could say in days, maybe I'm exaggerating to say days, and it was weeks. But you definitely have policies that type. The corporate tax rate, I believe, went into effect in 2018. That was our first full year in office. We had the corporate tax rate that even Obama's people said we were supposed to have.
What do you think of both parties' disregard for the growing federal debt? We're now at around $1 trillion in debt payments each year, and the debt to GDP ratio is increasing. How big of a deal is this?
And I always had the view that long before any of these things came up, it's really the spending. Spending is when the resources are being used. The rest is how do we finance it? We know finance it with taxes later, or do you finance it with taxes now? Finance it by printing money. That's kind of a less important issue. Now, do we have too much debt? I mean, it's a lot by some of the metrics that you mentioned. But our government bonds are very expensive. They have low yields, in other words, those you who take in finance, right? An expensive bond has a low yield bond is an expensive bond. Our bonds are very expensive. It's a little bit hard to say you have a surplus of something that's expensive. Like I was saying, do we have too many diamonds? Do we have too much gold? So, you know, from that perspective, I'm not sure I see the real problem. The problem I see with the spending, a lot of spending, a lot of it's wasteful, a lot of it's fraudulent, criminal. I mean, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on criminals. They're taking it and we're letting them take it. I mean, so there's plenty of room to cut back the spending. And for my money, and it's only 1/300 millionth of my money, but if it were my money, I would want it spent a little more carefully and certainly not stolen so easily.
What are your thoughts on Harris's plan to have an opportunity economy and give more tax breaks to families in the middle class?
Opportunity economy is just a label. I mean, if we go back to my other incidents one. This is not an opportunity economy. This is what she's got planned. You're going to let the bureaucrats, go to town. We're going to be ripping all this stuff out. So all this stuff, when we rip all that stuff out, who's going to get the biggest benefit? It's going to be the people in the left bar. Who's going to have the smallest benefit? Still be a benefit, so I suppose they won't complain. The people in the top bar. So if you want to call that opportunity economy, fine. I understand we're reinventing words. Now words mean things today that they didn't mean yesteryear. But we're going to run the world the way PhDs want the world to be run, and the rest of you, too bad. You're not in charge. I mean, that's call it an opportunity economy. That's fine.
What do you view as the solution to Social Security?
Oh, I'm sure we're being recorded. You can go back at look at some of my older papers about gerontocracy. I had a paper called Gerontocracy. Don't know what that means. Geron, like geriatric, it's rule of the old people. I wrote this in the 90s, mind you. Now we have like senile presidents, speakers of the House and stuff like that. I wasn't quite envisioning that, but one of the major things in modern economies, not just the United States, old versus young. In fact, there's a political science book called Old v. Young. That's one of the major struggles. And I think one of the great questions of political science, why are the old so successful politically, they get a lot of resources from our government in a way that younger people do not. Why is that the case? And I offered some answers and things. At some level, they have a lot of political influence. Older people have a lot of political influence. Maybe it's their voting pattern. Even in non-democracies, they have a lot of influence. I'm always kind of having my eye on things toward, well, what does it do to the political power of elderly people? If it enhances the political power of elderly people, it's going to make Social Security problem even bigger. And one of the things I did early in my career on the gerontocracy, it's one of the reasons I did not work for the Bush administration. Bush wanted to privatize Social Security, and I thought that's going to be a disaster. It's going to make the older people even more powerful. Whatever power they have, they're going to have it. And then on top of it, their bank accounts are going to be massive by government decree. And that means that they'll just be able to, leverage that for even more power. So I'm not in favor of privatizing Social Security. Would enhance the political power of the elderly. Going in a European direction would be another way. I think the elderly are powerful here and getting a lot of government revenue here. Take a look at Europe. The elderly get very generous pensions. Italy, France, other European countries that try not to go in the European direction if you want to keep the Social Security program up, under some kind of management.
What are your thoughts on the Project 2025 agenda piece to allow executive control of the Fed?
Not sure I'm familiar with that. I can talk conceptually about executive control of the Fed. I mean, I've had issues with the Fed. I mentioned some of the issues that they mainly they're regulators, and they have this shiny object that they're holding over here called monetary policy. Oh, look at this and don't pay attention when I'm doing to that. I think that needs to be fixed. Does it need to be with the executive control or not? I'm not sure. Fed, some kind of Fed reform, maybe to separating the monetary part from the regulatory part, although they insist that they need to do regulation in order to be good at monetary. So I'll take that back. I do. I think John Taylor has a right. Have rules. Have a rule so that they don't have discretion. There's a certain program that they have to follow. We can all tell whether they're following the program, and it's as simple as that. And that's not very good for the human capital of the Fed people, because they want to go out. Look at what Bernanke does now, right? He advises Wall Street firms on how to read the tea leaves of the Fed. So I'm not optimistic that can happen, but some kind of Taylor type of rule, rather than giving a regulatory discretion to the Fed, I think would be a good idea. And for that matter, every other regulatory agency.
Great, thank you. This is going to be our last question. How can the government reduce prices without an outright price cap on goods? For example, Trump said that he would do this by reducing the cost of energy. How effective and achievable is this?
I mentioned the example with internet. When we deregulated, it's a 2-line statute. Probably took 10 minutes for Congress to vote on, and another 10 for president to sign it. And it worked. And it lowered internet prices. Deregulating in energy would lower energy prices. Deregulating health insurance would lower health insurance prices. Deregulating automobiles would lower automobile prices. You could go on and on and on. We've seen it work over and over again. So confident it could happen again. The main barrier being the special interest. And every one of those deregulations that we did, there was some special interest is like, wait, this is the source of our profit. Please don't do that. In most cases, we beat them back, but even in the auto rules, we only rolled it halfway back because the auto companies said, hey, we kind of like that regulation. It kind of helps our bottom line. So please don't roll it back all the way. And so we rolled it back halfway.
So thank you, Casey. Thanks for taking the time and spending your evening with us. We hope you'll be back sometime
Pleasure.
next year or so. Thanks, everyone.